Robert Monks. We met each other when I was on the board of the Kennedy Center, and Millie was with me. So Millie and Bob helped create this event that we did. He needled me and said, Palm Beach is boring. Why don't you make it more interesting? And the fun part is we have, and all the other organizations have tried to follow us as well, because they were dumbing down people and we were trying to elevate. And I did ask Aspen Institute to come here and do this, and they weren't interested, so we did. Bob, Millie, and Dale, we all did it. And now we have a wonderful chairman, my friend, Bill Johnstone, right back there. Thank you. He's the chairman of the board. Listen, he's good. So let me introduce Bob. First and foremost, he's an activist. The activism in his life, was to tell the corporations, hey guys, the shareholders own this company, not you president and vice president. And we own this company, and he has represented the major funds, like the teachers union and all the other funds, including our government and all the others under Reagan, to stimulate and make people pay attention that who are the shareholders that really exist here. He has written widely about shareholder rights and the responsibility, and today he's going to share with us some of the insights that he has put into his new book, The Emperor's Nightmare, which is serious, Saving American Democracy in the Age of Citizens United. And for those who don't know what Citizens United is, it was declared at the Supreme Court that corporations they're citizens, and they have a right to contribute as much money as they want as any of us can do. And it explores how the corporations dominate the United States political process and has created a vast wealth gap. Now, Bob has written many other books, and there was a book written about him, and I thought it was I saw the book years and years ago. It's called Traitor to His Class. And so he comes from a long line family as Millie, and they have lived up in Maine and Boston, and he's not supposed to think based on his heritage the way he's thinking. And that's why they gave him that title. The name of the company that he founded, which is probably the most important one in the country, it was called Institutional Shareholder Services. It's now the leading corporate governance consulting firm around. So, anything I forgot, Bob, you just fill in, okay? Thank you.
I think I'll have to do something with this. Can you hear me? Well, yeah, I'm apt to get enthusiastic, and if I... Heavens! I don't know. How's this? Hi, there you go. Dale, thank you so very much. And Dale, it really is appropriate for all of us here to recognize the great gift that you have given to this community by making days like this possible. So thank you, Dale. Thank you so very, very much. What I'm going to tell you is a story, and it's a story of failure and an unwillingness to accept failure. About 25 years ago, I wrote a book called The Emperor's Nightingale, and The Emperor's Nightingale was a wonderful piece of mythology that I won't go into as it's quite long, but it had to do with the difference between human energy and mechanical energy. And my point in that book was that corporations had been treated as being like mechanical energy. What we needed to do is to get more human element into it. So I wrote this book, and it was very well received. It was about 1995. And about a couple of years ago, I looked around, and I had to come to the conclusion that it was a failure. And so rather than the Emperor's Nightingale, we now have the Emperor's Nightmare, because so much of what I had hoped to be able to accomplish, I had signally failed to do. The way in which I got interested in this was that I'd had a whole variety of careers, and one of them was running for office unsuccessfully. And in 1976, I was staying at a motel in the rather pretty little town of Brewer, Maine, on the Penobscot River. And in the middle of the night, I had to get up as my eyes were tearing and they were hurting. And I got up the next morning and I went down to the front desk and I said, "What's going on around here with this appalling odor?" And they said, "Oh, don't you know what that is?" And I said, "No." They said, "Well, that's what the paper mills send down the river every night in order to get rid of the trash." And it turned out, of course, that the way in which the rivers were used was as a way of moving logs downstream, for one thing, but for another thing, getting rid of all of the waste liquids that were involved in tearing the bark apart and tearing the wood apart and making pulp. And about 5 months, 6 months after I had to return to Boston in the banking business, having not won the election, I found that one of the things that chairmen do was to vote proxies. And guess what? A proxy crossed my desk that had the name on it of the company whose liquid was being flushed down the Penobscot River, which caused me a little bit of anxiety. And as the British would say, the penny dropped. And what became very clear to me was that people like me, running an institution, voting a lot of shares of stock, actually were the owners of companies. They weren't a million people. You could identify 20 people, 30 people who, as head of these large institutions, were in a position to create the real ownership energy and create a level of accountability. And it's trying to get access to those people that I spent the next 20 years. One of the difficulties in the dialogue has been the status of corporations in America. Now, a lot of people, particularly those on the Supreme Court, have talked about being bound by the language of the court, strictly by the language of the court. So as I talk, I want you to remember one thing. The word corporation is not mentioned in the Constitution. Now, that notwithstanding, what happened over the first 30, 40, 50, 60, up to the Civil War period, was that the leaders of the government were constantly warning people about big corporations in power. Jefferson, Madison, and finally, of course, Andrew Jackson refused to extend the charter of the Bank of the United States. Now, in the next period of time after the Civil War, two levels of creativity managed to characterize corporations first as being persons. Now, person isn't defined in the Constitution, but the word is used. And so therefore, by calling a corporation a person, somehow you could imagine a jurisprudence that had something to do with it. And then some years later, an even more imaginative bit of jurisprudence developed when the word speech was brought into the language as being equivalent to money. So we now have a constitution which has a protection of freedom of speech, and we have it applying to persons who are now corporations, and speech is now money. So that is where we got to without any mention of the word corporation in the Constitution. There was a great deal of energy expended by the Congress of the United States in the 19th and 20th century to specify the exact limits of corporate financial involvement in political activity. And I have to tell you, I ran 3 times, and I ran under 3 different laws. And there wasn't anything magical about any of them. I mean, they were all tedious, but they were an effort by the government to try to deal with the problem. Now, you notice I say government. Later on in my comments, I'll distinguish between government and the Supreme Court, although I think most people would think that they were part of the same thing. The most remarkable book trying to describe the relationship of corporations to our society was written 90 years ago. And Sam, I know you were around, but I don't think you probably, I don't think you probably read it. But let me just read something I don't like to do and say, this was a book called The Corporation and the State in Modern Society by Adolph Burley and Gardner Means. And the publishers wouldn't publish it in the first place because they thought it said things they didn't want said, which is rather strange, but there it was. 1932, the state seeks in some aspects to regulate the corporation, while the corporation, steadily becoming more powerful, makes every effort to avoid such regulation. Where the rise of the modern corporation has brought a concentration of economic power which can compete on equal terms with a modern state, economic power versus political power. Each, its own interests are concerned. It even attempts to dominate the state. The future may see the economic organism, now typified by the corporation, not only on an equal plane with the state, but possibly even superseding it as the dominant form of social organization. The law of corporations assuming the aspect of economic statesmanship. 90 years ago. And it's not a bad description of where we are now. And it's an extraordinary perception. It turned out that the modern version of the corporation was in many ways the result of the work of 2 people, and they were quite extraordinary people. The first of them was a man named Lewis Powell. And Lewis Powell was one of the first families of Virginia, or if he wasn't, he married one of them. He lived in a Civil War house. He went to the local law school. He got a graduate degree at Harvard Law School. He was the man to go to in the South. I called him once when I wanted to get some help with a corporate takeover, and I found that that wasn't the side of the coin he was on. But in 1977, he wrote a letter to his client, who was on the Chamber of Commerce of the United States. And the Powell letter, or the Snyder letter as it's oftentimes called, took the position of a corporation as it was then perceived by him as being discriminated against in society, where people who were beneficiaries of the corporation were putting money into trying to undo what the corporation was trying to do. The greatest enemy that the corporation had in America was Ralph Nader. Seriously, my law school classmate, then not very old, he was the greatest enemy that the Chamber of Commerce of the United States could think of for the corporation. Well, that's rather odd. The funny thing is, they were right. The letter set out, it's about 40 pages long, and it set out a very specific curriculum for what needed to be done in order to reverse the trend away from corporate power in our society. It ended with a rather interesting note. It said that perhaps the finest way in which our society could create a relationship with corporations was through the judicial branch of government. About 6 weeks after that letter, sorry about that, I got enthusiastic and got away from that. About 6 weeks after the letter was sent to the Chamber of Commerce, President Nixon appointed Lewis Powell to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, in the hearings for his approval, this subject never came up. It was said that one of the journalists at the time knew it but didn't let it out. In any event, he got confirmed. I think it was 88-1, and the one was a man from Oklahoma who didn't approve of anything. So he was really an extraordinarily well-educated and well-motivated person about the importance of corporate power in the state. He wrote an opinion in 7 years after his original letter called Bellotti versus the First National Bank of Boston. By the sheerest coincidence, I was chairman of a bank in Boston that was a co-plaintiff, although I have to say we were just minor, small players, but it was kind of an amusing coincidence. And that was the one in which the concept of corporate speech was formally identified as being the law of the United States. Now remember, corporation wasn't mentioned in the Constitution, but we're now getting to the point where it is said in that opinion, which was written by Powell, that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts did not have the power to restrict corporations for spending whatever amount of money they wanted to for a public referendum. A fascinating thing is Powell was so critical to everything that happened here. A couple of other things I'll mention later, like the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable. He had, like so many Supreme Court justices, an official biography written. And that's by somebody who's been a clerk of his and who will treat him right. In the course of this biography, they all end up being about 500 pages long. I've read several of them. They never mention his work as being the founder of corporate capitalism in America. It's never mentioned. The Bellotti case isn't mentioned. The Snyder letter isn't mentioned. I called up the man. His man's name is Jeffries. I called him up and I read it. I said, well, I see you've people have said this is one of the finest judicial biographies that's ever been written. And I just wondered, what's been excluded from other biographies that makes them competitive with this? And he didn't have much of a sense of humor, but the answer is I didn't get an answer to it at all. And it's a fascinating question when you stop to think of it. Here is a man who had the most extraordinary impact. And yet in a 600-page book, not a hint. Why? I asked Jeffries why. Maybe he answered it, but I didn't understand the answer. Well, beyond the extraordinary leadership of Powell, the second person who's rather better known to everybody is Chief Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court of the United States. And his particular involvement here was in the Citizens United case. And there was a circumstance where I see in the room people who are better qualified than I to describe in detail the peregrinations that the court went through in order to even bring up the question. As you know, you can't just bring a case before the Supreme Court. It has to pass a number of hurdles, and they're not insignificant. What happened was a case came before the court. Chief Justice Powell saw an opportunity to invent a new plaintiff and invent a new claim and to ask the parties to re-argue the new case. that wasn't the case that was brought in the first place. And over the course of the summer, they wrote a brief and a new case, but they didn't compile a record. You always have to have a record for a case when in times of appeal where people will be able to go back and find what did you rely on. There is no record in the case of Citizens United. And when the case finally came up for argument in the fall, I think it was the first item on the agenda of the fall, 5-4 vote. Chief Justice Powell was the 5th vote. Now, Citizens United, among other things, overruled 2 earlier cases. They're not supposed to do that in the Supreme Court. You're supposed to, only under circumstances of extreme change. Well, it turns out it overruled a case that had been decided by the court 6-3 about 5 years previous. And suddenly 5-4, what happened? 2 people quit, and they appointed 2 new people. And as Sandra Day O'Connor said, she was one of the people who had quit. She said, it's wonderful what happens around here when a couple of years go by without me. And so Citizens United became the law of the land, and it did not take into account the extraordinary effort that the Congress had put into trying to deal with this field. Well, as a matter of sort of normal civics, the person who passes laws and who makes laws are the executive branch and the legislative branch. Here it was one of the clearest cases of where the judicial branch took it over to define it. And whether that is an appropriate thing, a place for a court to be and for our system to be, is really a very serious matter. Think of it for a minute. That was decided 5-4. And how can you change it? How, under the law of the United States, can you change it? There's only one way you can change it, and that is have an amendment to the Constitution. Or do what Roberts did in the first place and overrule it once again. So, in effect, our judicial system has now allowed the status of corporations to be determined by a court which is highly conscious of the desirability of a corporate state and provides no method that is really within normal people's reach. The effort, what do we have? We've got now, how many amendments to the Constitution? 27? I think it's 27. What is it, Bob? 27 amendments? I think so. Okay, that's not a lot of amendments for 250 years. And 10 were done in the first, 10 years. It's bloody hard. And yet, as I'll tell you later, we have a Nightingale who is trying to do just this. But so the place where we're at created an atmosphere. And here's what my book is about in large measure, is to describe what happened and how did we get here? What has been happening to our country? What do we actually not have a sufficient amount of control over? Well, the first thing to understand is the role of lobbyists. Lobbyists are a very good thing and a very necessary thing in society. You need to have people communicating between business and government so as to end up with a result that takes into account the broad variety of interested people and then deals with it in that way. What I'm talking about as lobbyists is something quite different from that. Among other things, just to give a little perspective on it, the amount of money that people who admit to being lobbyists admit to spend is more than the entire cost of the United States Congress and supporting staff. The extent of lobbying expenditure in the last 30 years has gone up about 3 times to some $4 billion a year. Now, you also must understand that there is not a gold star that comes on someone's head when they're a lobbyist so that you can identify them. They're a self-identifying clan. Most of the people who are thought of as being the best and most desired lobbyists aren't registered. They're consultants, they're lawyers, they're, you name it. So in effect, the mind boggles when you think of what the real expense of lobbying in this country involves. You have to think that what has happened, for example, in the most lobbied sector, the financial sector. It's gone from 3% of the GDP to 9% of the GDP. It's tripled in size, the financial sector, almost entirely attributable to lobbyists. I'm sure you've all heard it said that it's impossible to read an act of Congress because it has 500 pages or 600 pages or something. Did you ever ask yourself, why have they got 500 pages? They didn't used to have them. Well, I have to tell you, there are a whole lot of people who are making an awful lot of money putting one of those pages into the bill, and they're called lobbyists. And so our system has accommodated itself to a level of outside power. Now, perhaps the most important lobbyist in recent times has been the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It was always a rather polite, pleasant organization. Indeed, the head of Millie's family company, her family company, was the chairman of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, you know, a nice coal and oil company from Maine. They don't have that, not anymore. What the Chamber of Commerce did was pretty much what Powell recommended in his memorandum. They basically organized a new law firm that consists of people who have been clerks of the court, of the Supreme Court, who are quite likely to be able to get access because of their connections with the court and their high success in doing appeals. It has raised money from everybody with one of the appalling scandals of the Citizens United opinion. Justice Kennedy, who wrote the opinion, said that there can be no objection to corporate expenditures because the corporations will reveal what they're spending and it will give the shareholders the opportunity to protest if they don't like it. Earth to Justice Kennedy, that never was and never will be. And unfortunately, organizations such as the Chamber of Commerce are what the French called a linge, a washing machine for corporate money so that no one will ever know who gave them that money. Hence, it isn't just a lot of money goes into politics and a lot of money goes into lobbying. It's that a lot of the money is not disclosed, and there's no obligation on people to make that disclosure. So, again, you have to think, what has been the result of this? Well, the power of corporations is expressed most dramatically in the extent to which they direct the allocation of resources among the various components of society. So when you find that the average income is moved from the top quintile to the bottom quintile, it represents the power of the corporate lobby to control the disposition of a larger portion of the gross product. In the course of the last 30 years, when I first came to Washington, I had once had to stand up as a defendant in an antitrust case, and I was really, I'm a little bit humble about it. And guess what? Washington law firms were shutting as there was no more antitrust law. Now, I think there may be some come back now, but the logic of antitrust has changed. It used to be if you did things that were bad, you can see why I'm not a law professor. If you saw things that were inimical to society's best interests or whatever, you could bring a case, and ultimately some kind of remedy would be affected to keep the very large corporations from discriminating against their competitors. And in the last part of the 1970s, the two big cases were IBM and Microsoft. Both cases they lost in the company lost in the district court, and they won either at the appeals level or when President Reagan got elected, the court cases went away. And at that point, they decided that antitrust law would no longer be concerned with whether it was right or wrong. It was going to be considered with whether it made things cheaper for people. So if you had a lower cost, you couldn't be accused of antitrust problems. Well, you can imagine what happened with the revolution of technology. I mean, suppose at the beginning of the period of time, you were trying to buy a cell phone. And if you analyzed a cell phone, it was capable of so much memory, it was capable of so much transmitting capability, and you compared that with what you got 10 years later, and the price had gone down. That's not antitrust. But the trouble is, it was the capacity of the technology with the particular products they were selling to thereby totally dominate the market and to continue to acquire other companies in their field. And they were so gigantic. When you stop and think of it, when you were kids, do you ever think anybody would sell 1 billion of anything in the course of a year? Well, that's what's happening now. I mean, and so the volume that the people had who were the leaders here was so substantial that they could keep buying up any competitor of any kind, and they threw away the ones that didn't make any difference. So we ended up without an antitrust law and with this enormous concentration of power and wealth in one sector. And that, I think it's something like the big five own, or did before last month, 30% of the stock market. And, you know, with an uninhibited capacity to buy competitors, that's a very different kind of country. Another thing that happened in the last years is that in the 1970s, the government passed a really very inspired law called ERISA. And if you want to know what ERISA means, the last people I talked to about it said it means every rotten idea since Adam. But it really is the Employees Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, the first thing that Jerry Ford signed on becoming president. And what it attempted with great care and sensitivity to create a real retirement system for Americans. Now, what do I mean by real retirement? Real retirement is something when there's money in the bank and a commitment by a creditworthy person to continue making payments according to a formula and to thereby provide for employees a defined benefit pension at the end of their time. What do you think's happened to defined benefit plans in America? They're gone. I mean, and IBM was the company that first decided they couldn't, it wasn't competitive. That's what it wasn't. So all of that money that used to go for pensions for employees, and for employees, you had to give them to everybody. You couldn't just have them the way they are now for a few. It turns out, I made a rough calculation on this, and this is one reason I don't get invited out to dinner too often. I said, is the amount of money that companies, quote, saved by not having a defined benefit plan equal to the amount of money that they have increased the compensation of their chief executives. You guessed it. My intuition was on a high level, but my adding machine was even better. That's exactly what they did. So that's another thing that happened. Now, on the other side of the coin of something not quite as big as that, for the transfer of wealth. And that's what we're talking about. That's what's happening. It's corporate values that are occurring, and wealth is going to top corporate people. The Social Security system continues to be something that a lot of people live on. We're told it's going bankrupt, always going bankrupt, but I guess people now, figure it's a competition to see which government entity is going to go bankrupt, so they're not going to be too fussed about the Social Security. But at the moment, I never had realized until I studied the subject that the amount that is deducted from your salary has a limit. It is limited on a certain percentage, a certain dollar level of income. So if you have $138,000 a year of income, you will pay a percentage of that to Social Security. After that, every penny is free of tax. Now, first, Social Security system is broke. Secondly, why, with all of the inequality we have in our society, are we taking, without a doubt, the most critical thing for the poor people and taking it away from, by far, the richest people? And there it is. And yet, this is the kind of thing that you just don't read about, all put together, which is why I have the effrontery to take some of your time. Unions, people liked them or didn't like them. But as a practical matter, over the last 25 years, union membership has gone from 25% of the workforce to 9% of the workforce. For many purposes, unions have ceased being a functioning entity in American society, except public employee unions, which continue to play a controversial role. Some of what they do is good and some isn't, but that's life. An astonishing fact is if you had to be quizzed on the relative amount of money that is paid in taxes by individuals or by corporations, what would you guess? Is more money paid in taxes by corporations or by individuals? Well, a very sophisticated answer. Corporations don't pay tax indeed. As a numerical matter, in the last 25 years, individuals have gone from 50 billion to 200 billion, and corporations have gone from 50 to 200, individuals have gone from 100 to 1,800. So corporations have increased. I guess this is probably the amount of deflation of the currency or something like that. But in any event, one rise is by 4 and the other is by 9. Then, of course, we have the tax breaks in the last president's administration, which it cost about $1 trillion, but it was real money and it came for the benefit of the highest paid people. And so there hasn't really been any sensitivity to trying to deal with these enormous amounts of money in a way that addresses the increasing status of the lower income bracket of our society. And in these little ways, like Social Security and whatever have you, every place you look, there's been a little something chipped off on this. Now, one of the other places where we run into a lot of problem here is trying to get fair information out. And a Telecommunications Act of 1996 wiped out the previous protections against oligarchy for local media. Cable, internet, newspapers, radio, and TV have now been converted into oligarchic enterprises. There probably are 4 or 5 people who own them all. I mean, I can think of the people who own the newspapers, and I can think of the people who own a lot of radio stations. And so what does this mean? What this means is that our ability to get a critical evaluation from the press or from any kind of communication system has been lost. And that absent that, it's very difficult to be able to have people understand what I hope I've helped you to understand today, that we have a really serious problem of unfairness, that it is largely in place because lobbyists are far more effective than ordinary citizens at being able to figure out what they're going to do about it, and so it continues. And my own view is that a lot of the unquietness in society today is a result of that. And I think that the only way we can deal with this is to try and get more control over the corporations. Because I don't think we're going to get control over the political system until we get the position of corporations in a more proper role. And for that, a number of steps can be attempted. But after my failure of the last 20 years, I have to tell you I've got a lot of humility in this particular subject. But I do think that there are a few things that we can do, and we have to start somewhere, because the current system really is intolerable when you stop to think about it. And so there is a young man in the Northeast named Jeff Clements who has been working for 3 years on trying to do the 28th constitutional amendment, which will be in effect to overrule Citizens United. And he's about halfway there. But as I've mentioned to him oftentimes, halfway there when the tide is going out, it isn't very helpful. And it's just a lot of hard work. I hope you'll get there, but it's the right direction. It's one of the ways something can be done, but it's almost defying of our past experience to think that he would get there. Then we really have to do something about the corporations themselves. One of the reasons why corporations weren't mentioned in the Constitution was because the states had already preempted the area for themselves. And at the time of the Constitution, states' rights were extremely important. And so therefore, they have left the situation the way they got it. And if you ever mention, what I'm going to mention, a Federal Corporation Act, I would be lynched by the Bar Association of all 50 states. There's nothing that is more important to the income of a law firm than large corporations. And so this is a hard thing to do, but it shouldn't be impossible. I think you should understand what the problem is. Some years ago in Michigan, there was a corporation in which in Illinois, between 2 very prominent families. And a lawsuit came out in which the seller was sued for not having had due care in selling the property to the person who bought it. And this went to the Delaware court, and the Delaware court agreed and said there was not sufficient care, and that therefore the directors are liable for negligence. A number of things occurred. A lot of people changed the dice, and it turned out that nobody really lost any money, and the Delaware legislature removed the provision for care in its statute defining the duty of corporations. Well, as the economists usually say, they believe in everything that money can buy according to the rules. Well, that, of course, set the smarter people in our society to change the rules. And So again and again, you come across these same kinds of problems. And what I want to leave you with is an impression. One, we really don't pay any attention to this. And I have to say, it's taken me a long time to actually be able to put together these relatively few comments. But it is perfectly clear that something is very wrong. Secondly, it is very clear that we have the ability to try to set this right. But in order to do that, there has to be an understanding of the extent of how wrong it is. I mean, when you stop and think, no tax on salary over 160,000 for Social Security. I mean, come on. It's just wrong. And so I want to leave you with the impression that it is important for people like you and me to understand what's happening and to look at what is happening and how elections are being financed, and how I have a long chapter in there on a particular family called the Wichita Mafia. I have had a good lawyer, and I'm not going to be sued for libel for that one, but however you want to put it. But the reality is that we are where we don't want to be. And on that happy note, I want to thank you for your diligence and your kindness.
Well, part of this group, we ask for comments. You do not have to agree with them, and we're happy to hear how you don't agree. And we're happy to hear any kind of opinions you have. So, who would like to talk? Okay,
Can I ask a question, actually? Okay, perfect. So I am interested in whether or not the corporations and the powerful people are still trying to sell what they do with the idea of trickle-down economics, and whether you believe that that's a real thing. I personally don't. That will be my comment in that. And my second question is, to the extent that the income inequality is as extreme as we've ever seen it, is that sustainable? And what happens? How does it break? Is civil war something we should be worrying about? Those are my questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, I was just trying to think, if I knew the answers, I'd run to the telephone and call in my stock selection. I think that I'll just tell you one word for the first part of your question. Are you familiar with the term greenwash?
No.
All right. Well, greenwash is that, as a result, I think in some measure, for work I've been involved with, many corporations and people have passed regulations for their internal conduct having to do with green values, climate change, whatever have you. Well, it turns out, and indeed, the Business Roundtable, they got Jamie Dimon up there and all the big boys, and they passed a law that said we're going to be interested in green things and nice things like that. And it turns out that, as you would have expected, we now have people who investigate them to see, and their tone is greenwash. And so on the first time, so far, we've got people at least willing to pay attention enough to prevaricate on various documents. Beyond that, I think, I'm sorry. Lisa, the next.
The second question was, how is this sustainable, and how does it all break down ultimately?
I ask myself that question all the time, and there are a lot of times I'm glad I live at the end of a 2-mile dirt road in Maine, because I can feel the pitchforks coming over the hill. As there's a lot of anger, and if you want to explain the anger, perhaps what I've said today would give you some kind of sense of how perfectly reasonable people could be very angry indeed. Now, as a practical matter, one of the ways that this happens is that people get defeated running for re-election in Congress. Now, that can get the attention. That really does get their attention, as they've got a lovely life and they don't want to leave it. Oh, incidentally, half of the people who leave Congress every year stay in Washington and are lobbyists. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of anger right now, and I think what you can do is to be supportive of it, because I think we have to find. I mean, obviously people are angry. So the question is, can we find something constructive way to do this before they come with the pitchforks?
How did the Supreme Court rationalize Citizens United being taxed like a corporation, yet being treated like a person? They can't be both at the same time.
I'm sorry, I wish I could give you an intelligent answer, but I don't know is the answer.
But we're living with the damage from that.
We certainly are. We certainly are. Yes.
I'll talk loud. Okay. Okay, thank you, Dale. Excuse me. Not getting off the topic too far, but we're also dealing with the question of the public's ignorance about how Congress works and what goes on right now. If Ralph Nader was probably still active, I don't know if he's active or what he's up to these days, but he would probably be interested in the fact that I just didn't know until this week, that there were no limits on what Congress can do in insider trading regarding themselves. I thought they had to have a blind trust. That's all voluntary. So if you've been reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, they're coming out on different ends of this about what some say, the New York Times, that Congress simply shouldn't invest at all or have somebody handle it for them, the money they didn't make as Congress. Others say we should have a blind trust. I don't think people realize this. I don't know how many congressmen and senators are now before the Ethics Committee that has no power anyway. That's number one. Number two, we're going to raise, I don't know how much $1 million, maybe you would know better than I, but we're going to spend on elections this year. Republicans, Democrats filling up the internet and television with these smash mouth ads, okay, that we're going to be treated to. Most people don't realize that we have 435 members of the House, 100 senators, am I about right? Only 40 districts in the House are competitive. So what's all the spending for? Most of the districts are as competitive as the old Soviet Presidium. We all know who's going to win. If you live in a Democratic district, the only question here where we live, Lois Frankel will win by 60% or 90%, depending upon who gets the Republican nomination. Why spend the money? Why raise the money for nothing? So I just throw these back at you because we're talking about a reform agenda. I think it's more than just the federal tax code and what you described, although what you said was quite important. So any thoughts? Partisan gerrymandering makes it harder for them to be defeated. And then there simply seems to be no ceiling about what they can spend on a race that's predetermined when they get into it.
I didn't hear the question.
I didn't know you were running for something. I said we're going to spend millions, billions of dollars on, now some people would say we spend more than that on potato chips. This year on a congressional election, 40 House seats are competitive. Why are we spending it on all the other districts too? Why are they allowed to spend money? And then take the money they spend, if I'm a committee chairman from a very safe district drawn from my party, I now can spend it on other races that I'm not in to keep my committee chairmanship now that we reformed the Congress Nader style and we now can elect chairman instead of having the speaker name them. That was the first question. So why don't I deal with that? Why are we spending all this money when no one leaves Congress the old way? Very few do. And what about insider trading bans on congressmen and senators?
I can't imagine why we don't have insider trading bans on. And there's a great problem, of course, with the Federal Reserve people, same problem, and the same problem with the judiciary. And I think on the other side, I think that we're still hung up with, what does speech mean under the Constitution? And I think as long as the speech is still construed the way the Citizens United jurisprudence brings us to, I think the answer to your question is that they're all freedom of speech questions. Well, this limits the amount of the malfaction, but it doesn't eliminate it. It's sort of like semi-adulterous, if you know what I mean. Please.
Why is Social Security in trouble if they could just print more money like they do for everything else?
The answer is, if they can keep printing money for everything else, we're not in trouble. But I'm not at all sure that that is a hypothesis that we are comfortable with. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I'm just wondering, we've been through McCain, Feingold, all of these things, and it just gets worse and worse, which is what you're talking about. I mean, the people that make the most money every year are the senators, because they get the best opportunities to vote on things before. The House is next, and then the professionals make just a little bit more than they did. Now, why can't that stop? I mean, why did we keep doing this and just giving Congress, an inside track to just cheat? I mean, it's crazy.
Well, I oftentimes find that if you sort questions out into categories, there is a categorizing sort that I like a lot that I think applies to this. It's called, is this sacred or is it profane? Now, in America, government and government ethics and government practices were always sacred. And we've utterly lost it. The sacredness of government is no longer an energy that seems to inform many people. I have a favorite who is a senator from Rhode Island who speaks endlessly on the subject, called Whitehouse. I never met him, but I've read his stuff, and he's there speaking on the Congress on just these issues. That it's a matter of do they have a sense of the sacredness of our governmental process? And without that, I hate to say it for a whole bunch of reasons, but I will. That is, they'll always be able to hire better lawyers than we can. Hence, no matter what it says, they'll end up getting the money. How's that for cynicism?
I interpret from your comments that you're strongly opposed to a cap on Social Security taxes. I'm curious why that is and how that relates to your core subject of corporate governance.
Well, the question on Social Security was one I put up as an indicator of the power that corporate power has. I'm not addressing myself to the Social Security system and its values or its demerits. I think that the problem of where does the government allocate resources, this is a part of it, because a government either allocates resources to the Social Security system or it allocates it to something else. And I'm saying that if they had more money, they would be able to allocate more to the Social Security system. And I believe that to be a virtue.
Any other people have a comment? Okay. Oh, we do.
What did they do exactly with the pensions? Did they stop paying them, or they just gave all the money that was in the pension fund to these CEOs?
No, they didn't. No, my dear. No, nothing quite as clear as that. They went through there's a lot about IBM doing this, is they were supposed to be the best company in the country from the point of view of employee relations and everything else. And they had a first-class CEO and everything else. And what they did was to say that they would let people who were still at a certain level have it, and then gradually ease out of it. And that's sort of how they did it. And so 10 years later, you wouldn't, it isn't there.
Remember when Rumsfeld wanted to take away the Social Security, privatize it?
Oh, that was George W.
They were going to get huge fees for that, right?
Of course. I once asked George W. what he was doing, and it's not a surprise he didn't know.
Oh. Can I comment on her question, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what happened is that the defined benefit plan went away and it became all defined contribution plans. So the employers, the corporations shifted the risk and the burden to the employee.
That's the critical. The critical thing is shifting the risk, because the real point. As you probably gathered, I used to be the federal official responsible for the retirement system. So I felt, and when I was there, we actually had money, and when we had too much money, guess what? Some fancy accountants were engaged, and the companies were allowed to accrue into their income the surplus. So if you had if you had a bad year and you accrued into your income a little bit of your pension surplus, you suddenly were eligible for the bonus again. So, it unfortunate, because they really did have a decent system, and it really would have given people income. It really would have given people a real pension, and it's just preposterous. I mean, if you stop, it's not only increase in pay, but stop and think of how much money has been spent on stock buybacks. I mean, suppose that were used for the pension system. Could they afford that? I mean, it stinks.
Anybody else?
I have just one question. If you had to give a number, just let's say you had to throw out a number there, how high do you think inflation is going to go, given what we have right now?
Inflation.
Inflation number going to be
Inflation.
next year, this time in 2 years?
Oh boy. I personally think that it's overdue, so I'm a bit pessimistic about it. So I would say somewhere between 12 and 15%.
Of inflation?
Yeah.
That's what they're saying on television.
Haven't seen it. I don't think so, no.
But that's going to exacerbate the Civil War risk.
Yes, well, but wait a minute, but no, but listen.
This is lovely.
But listen, there's one thing to come first. With all of this printing money and everything else, and what do they call it? Modern monetary theory. That's tell us they were wrong last time and they'll be right this time. What do you think is going to happen when somebody says, gosh, we're already in a deficit bigger than last year because 6% times the cost of refinancing the national debt. See, we haven't had to pay anything to refinance the national debt for the last 25 years. And now, exactly. So that's, but that's a nasty piece of surprise that people have awaiting them. That, rather than that, people just assume that that's going to last forever. But when they start having to take something out of it, I don't know when they're going to stop the we can write money forever business. But I hope they stop it before it stops us.
Anybody else? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed it. I hope this made you think. Think.
Thank you.
And get the papers to see what's on for next week. So please come. Good, thank you.